Welcome to another episode of Healthy Kidneys After 60, the space where we slow down to listen to the silent signals of our bodies. I am your host, Jane Pauley. Aging is often described as a sunset, beautiful yet fading, but for many of us, it is shadowed by a quiet, persistent fear, the fear of a sudden health crisis that could change everything in the blink of an eye. Today, we are not just talking about statistics, we are talking about survival, intuition, and the precious minutes that define our future. Joining me is a man who has spent over 5 decades peering into the complexities of the human brain and heart, a voice of reason and compassion in the medical world, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Dr. Gupta, thank you for being here with us today.
It is a profound honor to be here, Jane. I often tell my patients that the most sophisticated medical equipment in the world isn't in my hospital. It is the intuition of the person sitting right in front of me. After seeing more than 20,000 patients, I have realized that the body rarely stays silent before a storm. It whispers. Sometimes those whispers are so faint that we mistake them for the wind of old age. I am here today because I want to help our listeners translate those whispers into action. It is a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you and everyone listening at home.
Dr. Gupta, I was reading a report recently that felt like a cold splash of water. It stated that in the United States, someone suffers a stroke every 40 seconds. That is almost twice every minute. When I hear those numbers, I picture a sudden, violent collapse, like a tree being struck by lightning. But in your experience and in the research coming out of places like Harvard and Tokyo, is it always that dramatic? I often wonder if we are looking for a roar when we should be listening for a sigh. Many of our listeners are in their 70s and 80s, and they live with this nagging anxiety that one day they might just lose control of their limbs or their speech without any warning at all. Is it true that the body gives us a golden window before the tragedy actually strikes, or are we truly at the mercy of a sudden blackout that we can never see coming?
Jane, you've touched on the exact nerve of the issue. That image of the falling tree is what haunts most people, but the reality is often much more subtle. And in that subtlety lies our greatest opportunity. When we look at the data from Harvard and the extensive longitudinal studies conducted in Tokyo, we see a pattern that is almost poetic in its tragedy. The body almost always tries to warn us. A stroke is not usually an instantaneous event. It is a process that culminates in a blockage or a bleed. Before the big event, there are often these tiny flickering moments we call micro-signals. Think of it like a light bulb in an old house. Before the fuse blows and leaves the room in total darkness, the light often flickers once or twice. In medical terms, we talk about the golden window, and while many think of that window as the time after you arrive at the ER, the real golden window is the 60 seconds when the flickering first begins. If you can recognize that flicker for what it is, a cry for help from your brain, you change the entire trajectory of your life. The problem is that as we age, we become experts at making excuses for our bodies. We tell ourselves we're just tired, or the room is a bit dim, or we stayed up too late watching the news. We rationalize the whisper away until it becomes a scream that we can no longer ignore.
It is so easy to rationalize, isn't it? I think about my own friends and how we talk about senior moments or feeling a bit dizzy after standing up too fast. We laugh it off because the alternative is too frightening to face. But what you're saying is that these small, almost invisible moments are actually the brain struggling to maintain its grip on reality. It makes me wonder about the psychological weight of this. Are we, by ignoring these signs, unknowingly participating in our own decline? It's a heavy thought, Dr. Gupta. If someone is sitting in their living room right now feeling a slight heaviness in their arm or a strange momentary blur in their vision that vanishes after a minute, how should they perceive that time? Is it just a glitch, or is the clock truly starting to tick against them in a way that requires immediate, almost breathless attention?
It is the most critical minute of their lives, Jane. I want everyone listening to understand this. Time is brain. Every second that a part of your brain is deprived of oxygenated blood, nearly 2 million neurons die. 2 million. In a single minute, that is a staggering loss of memory, movement, and identity. When you feel that glitch, your body isn't just malfunctioning, it is performing a rehearsal for a disaster. The research is very clear that these transient episodes where symptoms appear and then vanish are the precursors to a major stroke in a high percentage of cases within the following days or even hours. People feel relieved when the symptoms go away. They think, oh, thank goodness, I'm okay now. But in reality, that relief is a trap. That minute of symptoms was your brain's way of showing you exactly where the weakness is. It's as if the universe gave you a sneak peek at the script so you could change the ending. We have seen in clinical practice that those who treat that 1 minute of feeling off as a life or death emergency are the ones who walk out of the hospital with their lives intact. The ones who wait for the symptoms to come back or get worse are often the ones who never fully come back to us. We have to shift our mindset from waiting to see to acting to save. It isn't about living in fear, it's about living with a heightened sense of respect for the signals our nervous system is sending us every single day.
Dr. Gupta, you mentioned how we often dismiss these warning signs as simple symptoms of aging, and it reminds me of so many people I know who wake up feeling a bit off and just decide to head back to bed for an hour. There is this deep-seated habit in our generation to not want to be a burden or to cause a fuss over something that might just be a lack of sleep or a bit of dehydration. But when does just being tired cross that invisible, dangerous line into something that requires an emergency call? I think many of us are terrified of overreacting and looking foolish at the hospital, so we wait for the feeling to pass, hoping that our bodies will just reset themselves like they used to when we were younger. How do we break this cycle of dangerous politeness and self-denial before it's too late?
That is the tragedy of the polite patient, Jane, and it is a pattern I saw vividly in a gentleman named Robert Miller, a 72-year-old retired teacher living in San Diego, California. Robert was the kind of man who never wanted to bother anyone, and one Tuesday morning he was sitting at his kitchen table having breakfast with his wife when something very subtle happened. As he reached for his coffee, his right hand suddenly felt heavy, like it was made of lead, and he dropped his spoon. When he tried to apologize to his wife, the words felt like they were stuck in thick molasses, and his speech was slightly slurred for just a moment. Instead of calling for help, Robert looked at his wife and gave a weak smile, thinking to himself that he probably just slept in a strange position, or that his blood sugar was a little low because he hadn't finished his toast yet. He actually told her that he was just feeling the wear and tear of his 72 years and that he needed to go lie down on the sofa for a bit. He was convinced that a quick nap would clear the fog, and that is the most dangerous thought a person can have in that moment, because while Robert was trying to sleep it off, the blood flow to a small part of his brain was being choked off. This tendency to blame age for neurological deficits is what we call the age trap in clinical medicine. We assume that because we are older, we are supposed to feel weak or confused, but loss of function is never a normal part of aging. Robert was lucky because his wife noticed the slight droop in his face that he couldn't see, but thousands of others in his position choose the sofa over the hospital every single day, and they never wake up the same again.
It's heartbreaking to realize that Robert thought he was being sensible by resting, when in fact he was letting the clock run out on his recovery. I can almost hear his internal monologue telling himself to just stay calm and wait for the tiredness to go away so he wouldn't worry his wife or spend hours in a waiting room. This psychological barrier seems just as deadly as the physical blockage itself, especially for those who pride themselves on their independence. How can we help people understand that in these 60 seconds, being sensible actually means being aggressive, and that there is no such thing as an overreaction when it comes to the brain?
We have to redefine what strength looks like for seniors, Jane. For someone like Robert Miller in San Diego, strength wasn't about toughing it out on the couch. It should have been about acknowledging that his brain was sending a distress signal. When Robert finally got to us, he admitted that deep down he felt a strange sense of doom, but he pushed it down because he didn't want to admit he was vulnerable. This is what I see constantly, patients who experience a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, and because the symptoms disappear within minutes, they convince themselves it was a fluke. Robert's hand regained its strength after 10 minutes and his speech returned to normal, which only reinforced his belief that it was nothing serious. He almost didn't come in at all. But a TIA is a warning stroke, a gift of time that the body gives you to prevent the permanent damage of a full-blown ischemic stroke. If you ignore the warning because you're afraid of being a difficult patient or because you think you're just getting old, you are essentially throwing away your best chance at a full recovery. I tell my patients that I would much rather see them in the emergency room for a false alarm 100 times than see them once after they've waited too long. We have to stop treating our health like a minor inconvenience and start treating it like the precious, fragile thing it is, especially after 60. Robert eventually recovered, but only because his wife was brave enough to ignore his protests and call the paramedics. We need to be just as brave for ourselves.
There is a common misconception that a stroke is like a light switch being flipped. Everything goes black and you fall to the floor. But from what you're describing, it sounds much more like a flickering candle or a city experiencing a brownout where the lights dim but don't quite go out. This must be why so many people are misled into thinking they are safe once the initial sensation passes. Can you explain why the disappearance of symptoms is actually the most dangerous part of this whole experience? It feels counterintuitive to tell someone that feeling better after a minute is actually a sign that they are in more danger than they realize.
You are absolutely right, Jane. The light switch analogy is what most people expect, but a stroke is more like a river slowly being choked by debris. Sometimes a small piece of debris clears for a moment and the water flows again. That's why the symptoms disappear, but the debris is still there, lurking, ready to cause a total damming of the river. In medical terms, when those symptoms vanish, we call it a TIA, and the danger lies in the false sense of security it provides. People think they've dodged a bullet, but in reality, the bullet just grazed them, and the shooter is still standing right there aiming at them. When the blood flow returns and you feel your arm again or your vision clears, your brain is essentially telling you that the system is failing but hasn't completely collapsed yet. It is the ultimate red alert. Research into these transient episodes shows that the risk of a massive life-altering stroke is highest in the first 24 to 48 hours after these temporary symptoms occur. By feeling better and going back to their daily routine, people are walking around with a ticking time bomb in their heads. They think they are safe because they can speak and move again, but the underlying cause, the plaque in the artery or the heart arrhythmia, is still there, and it will strike again, usually much harder the second time.
That is a terrifying thought, that the moment of relief is actually the beginning of the most dangerous countdown. It's like being in the eye of a hurricane and thinking the storm is over when the worst part is yet to come. I think for many of our listeners, the idea that a 60-second blur or a momentary weakness could be a precursor to losing their independence is a hard pill to swallow. Why is the brain so deceptive in this way, and how does the medical community view this calm before the storm?
The brain is deceptive because it is incredibly resilient and tries to reroute functions as long as it can. It wants to keep you going, so it compensates, but that compensation has a limit. In the medical world, we view that calm as the most critical period for intervention. If we can get a patient in during that window when they feel fine again, we can use imaging to find the source of the problem and treat it before the permanent damage occurs. We can start blood thinners, perform a procedure to clear an artery, or stabilize blood pressure. But if the patient stays home because they think they're cured, we lose that chance. I've seen so many people who had a little dizzy spell on a Friday, felt better on Saturday, and were paralyzed by Sunday evening. It is a haunting cycle of missed opportunities. We have to educate everyone that the disappearing act of stroke symptoms is not a recovery. It is a stay of execution. You have to move, and you have to move fast, even if you feel perfectly normal by the time the ambulance arrives. That normalcy is your only chance to stay that way.
It seems like we are often our own worst enemies when it comes to these subtle signs, especially when we mistake a life-threatening neurological event for a simple physical ailment. I've heard so many stories of people who felt a sudden wave of dizziness and reached for a glass of water or a salty snack, thinking their blood pressure had just dipped. It's such a natural human reaction to try and fix the problem with what we have at home. But in doing so, are we inadvertently masking the very symptoms that should be sending us to the hospital? This confusion between a bad day and a brain event seems to be a major hurdle for the elderly.
It is a massive hurdle, and I often think of Margaret Collins, a 68-year-old grandmother from Tampa, Florida, who fell exactly into this trap. Margaret was a very active woman, always gardening or playing with her grandkids, but she started having these spells where the world would suddenly tilt. One afternoon, while she was sitting on her porch, she felt a wave of intense vertigo. She didn't feel pain, she didn't lose consciousness, she just felt like she was on a boat in a storm. Margaret's first instinct was to tell herself that she hadn't had enough water that day, or that the Florida heat was finally getting to her. She even thought maybe it was her inner ear acting up again. So she did what most people would do. She sat very still, drank a large glass of iced tea, and waited for the world to stop spinning. After about 20 minutes, the dizziness faded, and she went right back to her gardening, thinking she had simply overdone it. What Margaret didn't realize was that her dizziness wasn't about hydration or the heat. It was a TIA caused by a small clot temporarily obstructing the blood flow to her cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls balance. By treating it as a normal bout of exhaustion, she missed the opportunity to address a major blockage in her carotid artery. This is the silent mistake so many make, applying a simple solution to a complex hidden problem.
Margaret's story is so relatable because who hasn't felt a bit lightheaded and blamed it on the weather or a skipped meal? It's a very logical conclusion to draw in the moment, but it sounds like the key difference is the suddenness and the quality of that dizziness. For someone like Margaret in Tampa or any of our listeners, how can they tell the difference between the kind of dizziness that means sit down and drink water and the kind that means call 911 immediately? Are there specific red flags that accompany this neurological vertigo that people are overlooking?
The hallmark of a stroke-related dizzy spell is its suddenness and what I call the company it keeps. For Margaret Collins, the dizziness came out of nowhere, not after standing up too fast, but while she was perfectly still. That's a major red flag. Also, if the dizziness is accompanied by even the slightest bit of double vision, a sudden headache, or a feeling of clumsiness in one hand, it is almost certainly neurological. Most people, however, only focus on the dizziness because it's the most overwhelming sensation. They ignore the fact that they also felt a little bit of numbness in their lip, or that they couldn't quite find the right word for watering can. In Margaret's case, she actually had a slight tingling in her left arm, but she brushed it off as my arm falling asleep from sitting in the chair. We have to teach people that when multiple small things happen at once, even if they are mild, it is a system-wide failure. The mistake isn't just in the self-diagnosis, it's in the delay. Every minute Margaret spent drinking tea was a minute the clot was potentially preparing to move and cause a massive stroke. We have to stop looking for excuses and start looking for patterns. If the dizziness feels different or new, or if it happens while you are resting, you must assume the worst and hope for the best at the hospital. Margaret eventually had a major stroke 2 days later because she didn't report that first spell, and her recovery was much longer and harder than it ever had to be.
It is sobering to realize how much power we hold in those first few minutes and how easily we can throw it away. But I want to move towards something more hopeful, Dr. Gupta. We've talked about the dangers, but there is also a lot of incredible science happening right now that shows we can significantly improve outcomes if we act correctly. I was reading a 2024 study in the Journal of Stroke Medicine that discussed specific maneuvers and immediate actions that can reduce brain damage. It seems that even before the ambulance arrives, there are things we can do or not do that can change everything. Can you bridge that gap between the terrifying symptoms and the empowering science for us?
Science is indeed giving us tools that are remarkably simple but profoundly effective. I recently worked with a patient who followed these principles perfectly, a man who stayed calm when his body started to fail. When we look at the latest research, one of the most vital things we've discovered is the impact of body positioning and breathing on cerebral blood flow during those first 60 seconds. There was a case I managed where the patient felt the onset of numbness and immediately lay down flat on the floor, avoiding the instinct to sit up or walk around. By lying flat, they allowed gravity to help maintain blood flow to the brain, which is crucial when an artery is partially blocked. This patient also practiced what we call controlled slow nasal breathing. The 2024 study you mentioned highlights that rapid, panicked breathing, hyperventilation actually constricts the blood vessels in the brain, making the situation even worse. By breathing slowly and deeply, this patient kept their CO2 levels stable, which helped keep the brain's blood vessels dilated. When he arrived at the hospital, the imaging showed that while he had a significant blockage, the surrounding brain tissue was still remarkably healthy. We were able to clear the clot, and he walked out of the hospital 48 hours later with 0 deficits.
That is a staggering result, walking out in 2 days because of a few simple choices made in the first minute. It goes against every instinct to stay still and breathe slowly when you feel like your world is ending. Most of us would be pacing, calling out, or panicking. To hear that lying flat and breathing through the nose can reduce brain damage by up to 40% is just incredible. It makes me think about how much we need to train for these moments, almost like a fire drill for our own bodies. Is this something that every person over 60 should be practicing? And why does such a simple physical shift have such a massive impact on the brain's survival?
Absolutely, Jane. We should all have a neurological fire drill. The reason lying flat is so powerful is purely mechanical. When you are upright, your heart has to fight gravity to get blood to the highest point in your body, your brain. If a pipe is narrowed by a clot, that job becomes much harder. By lying flat, you remove that gravitational resistance, ensuring that every beat of your heart delivers as much oxygen as possible to the struggling neurons. It's like turning up the pressure in a hose to clear a kink. And the breathing, it's all about the chemistry of the blood. Slow, rhythmic breathing prevents the fight or flight response from taking over and shutting down blood flow to non-essential areas. When you stay calm, you are literally buying your brain time. I've seen the difference on the scans. A patient who panics and stays upright often has a much larger area of infarction, dead tissue, compared to the patient who lies down and breathes through it. This is the marriage of human composure and clinical science. It turns a helpless victim into an active participant in their own survival. This man I mentioned, he saved himself before I ever even touched him. That is the power of knowing what to do in that one critical minute.
We've talked about dizziness and heavy limbs, but I want to get very specific about some of the other bizarre signs that people might ignore because they don't fit the classic image of a stroke. And I'm thinking of things like a sudden change in vision or a fleeting moment of confusion. And I recall the story of James Anderson, and it strikes me as one of the most subtle yet dangerous examples of a silent warning. When something like your vision changes for just a few seconds, it's so easy to blame your glasses or a bright light. How can we distinguish these flickers from the everyday aging process? And why are they so critical to report immediately?
James Anderson's story is a perfect example of why subtle does not mean safe. James was an 81-year-old man from Columbus, Ohio, a retired architect with a very sharp eye for detail. One morning, while he was reading the newspaper, he felt as though a dark curtain was being pulled down over his left eye. It didn't hurt, it was just a painless gray blurring that lasted for exactly 60 seconds. And then, just as quickly as it came, it vanished. James, being a stoic man of 81, thought perhaps he had just rubbed his eye too hard or that his cataracts were progressing. He waited, he blinked a few times, and when his vision returned to normal, he simply went back to his coffee. He didn't tell his daughter, he didn't call his doctor. He thought, well, if it's gone, it can't be that bad. What James had experienced was something we call amaurosis fugax, which is essentially a mini stroke of the eye. A tiny piece of plaque had broken off from his carotid artery in his neck and traveled to the retinal artery. It was a direct warning that his main pipe to the brain was unstable. Because he didn't go to the hospital that day, 3 days later, a much larger piece of plaque broke off and caused a massive stroke that took away his ability to speak and move his entire right side.
It is haunting to think that a curtain over the eye was the only warning he got. It sounds so non-threatening, almost like a minor annoyance. But that 60-second flicker was actually a messenger saying there is a blockage in the main artery. When you talk about the FAST acronym, face, arms, speech, time, it's so helpful. But for someone like James in Ohio, the S for speech or F for face hadn't happened yet. It was just the I. Is it possible that we need to expand our own internal checklist to include these silent signals like vision loss or sudden unexplained clumsiness, even if they only last a minute?
We absolutely must. The FAST acronym is life-saving, but it is the end stage of the warning. By the time your face is drooping, the damage is already well underway. I want people to look for the pre-signs. If you lose vision in one eye even for 10 seconds, that is a medical emergency. If you suddenly find that you can't coordinate your fingers to button your shirt, even if it passes, that is an emergency. If you feel a sudden, worst headache of your life that disappears after a minute, you must act. James Anderson later told me that he felt silly calling a doctor for a 60-second blur. I told him that silly is a much better feeling than paralyzed. We have to overcome the fear of the false alarm. In James's case, if he had come in when the curtain fell over his eye, we could have performed a simple ultrasound of his neck, found the unstable plaque, and fixed it with a minor procedure. He would have been home in a day, still able to draw and talk to his grandkids. Instead, he spent months in a rehabilitation center. The lesson of James Anderson is that the body's most subtle warnings are often its most urgent. If a part of you shuts off for even a moment, be it your sight, your strength, or your balance, the clock has already started ticking.
Dr. Gupta, I want to talk about our daily routines. Many of us over 60 are very diligent. We eat our oatmeal, we take our vitamins, and we try to stay active. But I was startled to hear you mention that some of these healthy habits can actually be risky if they aren't timed correctly or if they lead to things like dehydration or thick blood in the morning. Specifically, there's been talk about Harvard research from 2023 regarding blood viscosity and the timing of our morning rituals. It seems that the very hours we feel most productive are also the hours when our blood is most likely to clot. Can you explain this paradox to us? How can something like a healthy breakfast or a morning walk actually become a trigger for a stroke if we aren't careful?
This is a fascinating and vital area of study, Jane. We often see a spike in strokes between 6 o'clock a.m. and 10 o'clock a.m., and it's due to a perfect storm of biological factors. When we wake up, our bodies release a surge of cortisol and adrenaline to get us moving, which naturally raises blood pressure. At the same time, after 8 hours of sleep, most of us are slightly dehydrated, which makes our blood thicker, what we call high viscosity. The Harvard 2023 study you mentioned really highlighted how this thick blood interacts with our morning habits. For instance, many people wake up and immediately head for a cup of coffee or a heavy breakfast without drinking water first. The caffeine in the coffee is a diuretic, which further dehydrates the system, making the blood even stickier. If you then go for a brisk walk in the cold morning air, your blood vessels constrict, and that thick, sticky blood has to be forced through narrower pipes. It's a recipe for a clot to form or a piece of plaque to break loose. It's not that the walk or the coffee is bad, but the context, dehydration plus a sudden spike in activity, is what creates the danger. I tell my patients to liquidate their blood before they do anything else in the morning.
Liquidate your blood. That's a very vivid way to put it. It makes me realize that we are often operating our bodies on empty during the most dangerous window of the day. We think we are doing the right thing by jumping into our day, but we are actually pushing a strained system to its limit. If you were to redesign the first hour of a 60-year-old's day to be stroke-proof, what would that look like? Beyond just drinking water, how do we manage this high-risk period without living in fear of our own morning routine?
The goal is a gentle awakening. Instead of jumping out of bed the moment you wake up, I suggest spending 5 minutes just sitting up slowly and drinking at least 8 to 10 ounces of room temperature water. This immediately starts to thin the blood and reduces that morning viscosity. We also need to rethink the heavy breakfast. A large carbohydrate-heavy meal redirects a lot of blood flow to the gut for digestion, which can ironically leave the brain with slightly less buffer during that high-risk morning window. The 2023 research suggests that a lighter start, focused on hydration and slow movement, is much safer. I also advise my patients to avoid sudden bursts of activity in the morning. If you need to garden or walk the dog, do it an hour after you've hydrated and your blood pressure has stabilized. We see so many morning strokes that could have been avoided if the person had just given their circulatory system time to catch up with their ambition. It's about working with your biology rather than forcing it. A stroke doesn't happen because you were unlucky. It happens because a set of conditions allowed a clot to win. By hydrating and slowing down, you make it much harder for that clot to ever form.
We've spent a lot of time on what can go wrong, but I want to dive deeper into what can go right. You've mentioned a technique called the blood shift maneuver, and it sounds almost too simple to be effective. When I think of life-saving medical interventions, I think of high-tech machines and complex surgeries, not a simple physical movement. But the story of Helen Brooks really illustrates how a small, deliberate action can be the difference between a tragedy and a near miss. Can you walk us through what Helen did and why this maneuver is something every senior should have in their toolkit?
Helen Brooks was a 76-year-old retired nurse from Portland, Oregon, and she is a testament to the power of staying calm and using simple physiology to your advantage. One morning, Helen was standing in her kitchen when she felt a sudden, profound heaviness in her left leg and a strange tingling in her face. As a nurse, she knew exactly what was happening, but instead of rushing to the phone in a panic, which would have spiked her blood pressure, she immediately performed what we call the blood shift maneuver. She slid down to the floor, lying completely flat on her back, and then she used a nearby footstool to elevate her legs slightly above the level of her heart. This is the shift by elevating the legs. She used gravity to shunt blood from the lower extremities directly toward the brain and heart. At the same time, she began that slow, rhythmic nasal breathing we discussed earlier. Helen stayed in that position for the 3 minutes it took for her husband to find her and call 911. By the time the paramedics arrived, her symptoms had actually begun to recede. Because she didn't try to walk it off or stay upright, she kept her brain oxygenated during the most critical minutes of the blockage.
It's incredible to think that Helen, in her mid-70s, had the presence of mind to literally reroute her own blood. It sounds so simple, yet I can see how it would be counterintuitive. Most people's instinct when they feel a limb go heavy is to try and move it, to shake it out, or stand up to see if they can still walk. But you're saying that the most heroic thing you can do is to become as still as possible and let gravity do the work. Is this blood shift maneuver something that can be done by anyone, even if they aren't as medically trained as Helen was?
Absolutely. You don't need a nursing degree to lie down and put your feet up. The blood shift is about physics, not complex medicine. The reason people want to shake it out is because they are panicked. They are testing themselves to see if they are broken. But that testing uses up precious oxygen that the brain needs. When Helen Brooks lay flat and raised her legs, she was essentially giving her brain a blood transfusion from her own body. The legs hold a significant amount of our blood volume, and by tilting them up, you ensure that the brain gets the lion's share of what's available. I tell my patients, if you feel the shift in your body, you must make the shift in your position. Helen's doctors at the hospital were amazed at how little damage she sustained despite a significant TIA. She was able to go home the next day because she had the discipline to stay still. This is the ultimate small habit that saves lives. It costs nothing, requires no equipment, and can be done in any living room in the world. It's about having the knowledge before the crisis hits so that your body reacts on autopilot. Helen didn't have to think, she just did. And that doing saved her independence.
Dr. Gupta, as we move toward the end of our conversation, I find myself thinking about the word preparedness. Often when we talk about health in our later years, it's framed as a series of losses or things to be afraid of. But today you've given us a different perspective, that being prepared isn't about fear, it's about power. You've mentioned some fascinating research from Japan about slow rhythm movement and how our daily lifestyle choices, from the food we eat to the sunlight we seek, can build a buffer in our brains. If you could give our listeners a golden rule for living their 70s and 80s with confidence rather than anxiety, what would that look like?
The golden rule is to realize that your brain is not a static organ. It is a dynamic system that responds to every small choice you make. The Japanese research on slow rhythm movement, things like Tai Chi or very deliberate, mindful walking, shows that these activities actually improve the autoregulation of blood flow in the brain. This means that if a small clot does occur, a brain that has been trained through slow rhythm movement is much better at rerouting blood around the problem. It's like having a GPS that automatically finds a side street when the highway is blocked. Beyond movement, I always emphasize environmental nutrition. We need sunlight for vitamin D and circadian rhythm stability, which regulates blood pressure. We need a diet rich in antioxidants, not as a superfood fad, but to keep the lining of our arteries flexible. But more than anything, the rule is to listen to the whispers. Do not wait for the roar. I want people to move through their day with a sense of informed peace. You are prepared because you know the signs, you know the maneuver, and you know that you have 60 seconds to make a difference. That knowledge should take away the fear, not increase it.
Informed peace. I love that phrase. It transforms the way we look at our health, from waiting for a disaster to proactively maintaining a system. It's a very empowering shift. I think many of us spend so much time worrying about the future that we forget we have the tools to influence it right now in our own kitchens and living rooms. It seems that the secret to a long, healthy life isn't just about the absence of disease, but about the presence of resilience.
Precisely, Jane. Resilience is built in the quiet moments. It's built when you choose to drink that glass of water in the morning, when you spend 10 minutes in the sun, and when you practice staying calm. I've seen patients in their 90s who have more neurological resilience than people 20 years younger because they've maintained their pipes and their circuits through these simple daily habits. We have to stop viewing aging as a slow decline and start viewing it as a period of refined maintenance. You are the captain of your ship, and while you can't always control the weather, you can certainly learn how to sail through the storm. The science is clear. We have much more control than we think. Whether it's the Japanese study on movement or the Harvard study on hydration, the message is the same. Small, consistent actions create a massive safety net. So, live your life. Go for that walk, enjoy your coffee, but do it with the wisdom of someone who knows how to listen to their body's whispers. That is the true golden age.
We began this conversation talking about Robert Miller, who almost slept through his only chance at recovery. His story, like so many others we've discussed today, Margaret, James, and Helen, reminds us that we are all just one 60-second window away from a completely different life. But the common thread isn't just the danger, it's the hope. It's the fact that in every one of those stories, there was a moment where action could change the outcome. Dr. Gupta, as we close this episode, what is the one thought you want our listeners to carry with them the next time they feel a little bit off? If they could only remember one thing from today's talk, what should it be?
I want them to remember that their body is always on their side. It is never trying to trick you, it is trying to save you. When you feel that 60-second blur or that momentary heaviness, don't view it as a betrayal by your body, view it as a gift of time. It is your brain's way of saying, I need your help right now. If you can remember that, you won't feel silly or embarrassed to call for help. You will feel empowered. Look at Robert Miller. He didn't panic in the end. He remembered what was at stake. He listened to his wife and he acted. Today, he is still teaching, still enjoying his life in San Diego. He didn't let the 60 seconds pass him by. My final message is simple. You are worth the effort of a false alarm. Your independence, your memories, and your future are worth more than any moment of embarrassment at the hospital. Listen to the whispers, be brave enough to act, and remember that you are never alone in this journey. It has been a true privilege to share this time with you, Jane, and with all of your listeners. Thank you for letting me be a part of your informed peace.
Dr. Gupta, thank you for your wisdom, your compassion, and for giving us the tools to face the future with confidence rather than fear. You've reminded us that while we cannot stop time, we can certainly master the minutes that matter most. And to our listeners at home, thank you for joining us on this episode of Healthy Kidneys After 60. We hope this conversation has brought you a sense of clarity and perhaps a little more peace of mind. Remember, your body is talking to you. Make sure you're listening. If you found today's episode helpful, please consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss our upcoming podcasts on staying vibrant and healthy through your golden years. We have so much more to share with you. Until next time, I'm Jane Pauley. Take a deep breath, stay hydrated, and be well. We'll see you in the next episode.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe and listen to your heart. It was a pleasure.